The YJB's Girls Working Group is designed to hear from professionals within youth justice on the work they are doing with girls in the justice system and an opportunity to share best practice with the sector.
Just to kind of let you know why we've gone with this theme today. So last time we met, you may recall, and you haven't seen it, I strongly urge you to go on the YouTube channel and look at it via the Resource Hub. Jenny, who is with us again today, did a magnificent session on the experience of girls and really what they bring along with their experience when you're doing an assessment on them. And it came about by somebody talking about, you know, how do we assess girls? So Jenny did this a magnificent session on thinking about girls' experience, what might have happened to them, what's highly likely to have happened to them. And when you're doing that assessment with them, whether it's an Asset Plus or a prevention and diversion tool, these are the things that you need to be thinking about in understanding that girl's lived experience and how that might interact with how she engages with the youth justice intervention and support that you'll be providing for her. This time, this quarter, we thought we'd focus in on a particular aspect of girls' lived experience, and that's the experience that they may have of being a victim and being a victim of crime, and what that might mean and what their experience of that is. And I've asked Cassandra to come along, and she's going to be presenting to you in a minute. She's going to be presenting with you in a minute the research findings from the Children Violence and Vulnerability Report from 2024. But just thought I'd start off by explaining why we're focusing on that particular topic, and how it jigsaws back to the session that Jenny led last time. Later on, we're going to be talking about so we're going to concentrate on the girl's experience of being a victim. We're also going to be talking about the White Ribbon organisation and what that means. So a little bit of information about White Ribbon, and how that's been implemented and linked into a particular service. So we've got 2 practitioners from Hull Youth Justice Service coming along, but also thinking about, when we're thinking about the girls' experience of being a victim, we need to be thinking not just about how we keep girls safe, but also about boys' behaviour and how that impacts on girls' experience of safety. So they'll be talking a little bit about some of the work they're doing in terms of domestic violence group for boys as well. So that is the theme and the issue for today. I hope we'll have a little time for a break halfway through. We'll see how we go. But that's the issue, that what we're going to be looking at today, and the reasons why we've focused on this as a key topic. So is everyone all right with that? The record button has been pressed. Please don't use AI. This hasn't been, we've not agreed for AI to be used on this meeting, so please don't use AI. And other than that, I can see Cassie there in the middle of my screen. So Cassie, I'm happy to hand over to you. I will stop sharing because I think you've got your own slide pack.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Yes, I will share my slides now. Yeah, just to say thank you very much for having me. I'm really kind of happy and excited to be here, and to get the opportunity, I guess, to talk about these findings and this topic, but also to sort of have the opportunity to kind of be here and connect with you all, and hopefully hear some of your reflections sort of as practitioners on some of these topics as well. So my name is Cassandra Popham. I work at the Youth Endowment Fund, and one of the sort of main things that I do is the lead on the Children Violence and Vulnerability Survey. And I'll give a bit more information on what that is in a minute. But today I'll be presenting findings from the 2024 survey, as Tracy said. This was published in November and December last year. And for the purpose of today, I've sort of really tried to pull out the results that are related to specifically girls' experiences as victims. So just to say, I'm going to go through, I'll give a bit of an introduction to the YEF and to the survey, and then pull out some of the key results. I then, at the end, framed some sort of very broad questions for you that, that I would really like to get your reflections on. If anyone has any sort of questions or reflections to share, that would be fantastic. So I guess just a sort of, warning now, or a request that if anything does come up during what I'm saying that, you'd like to question, or that sort of sparks something that you're thinking of yourself, yeah, I would love to hear that. I probably won't be very good at monitoring the chat, but feel free to put things in the chat and I'll come to them later, or ask questions at the end. Great. So without further ado, I thought I'd give a fairly brief introduction to the Youth Endowment Fund. I imagine many of you are familiar with us, but don't want to assume, so I just thought I'd kind of give a brief intro. So the YEF was established in March 2019. We were given a £200 million endowment from the Home Office and a 10-year mandate. And the purpose is essentially for us to find what works to prevent children and young people from becoming involved in violence and build a movement to put this knowledge into practice. To achieve this mission, we primarily work across 7 key sectors, which I've listed on the right there. So that's children's services, education, health, neighbourhoods, policing, youth justice, and the youth sector. And while we work sort of broadly across various different sectors, we really try to focus a lot of our work and our research and also our change work on these sectors, because we think these are some of the most important to potentially oh, sorry, I just think someone's not on mute.
I've just muted.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, so we think these sectors are some of the most key to really supporting children and supporting children who are already involved in or at risk of violence, and supporting children, preventing them from becoming involved in violence. So we do quite a lot of work for this aim. Some of the main stuff that we do is around we pair projects, programs that are aimed at, helping prevent children from becoming involved in violence. So that could be things such as mentoring programs or boxing programs. And we pair them with academic evaluators to test whether these interventions are actually effective in preventing children from becoming involved in violence. So that's one of the key things we do. But we also do a whole host of other research as well. One of the other key things we do is a lot of sort of evidence synthesis work, where we pool together all the available existing research on approaches to preventing children and young people from becoming involved in violence. And the YEF toolkit, which you may or may not have heard of, is sort of one of our main outputs. It sits on our website, and it's basically a sort of resource, a repository of all of this, these overviews of existing research and a summary of different potential interventions, whether it's likely that they would have an impact on reducing children's involvement in violence, what the quality of that evidence is, what the cost would be of sort of implementing that intervention, and so on. And so I just thought it was worth putting here. There's a link to it on the website in case you haven't heard of it, or a reminder that it does exist. And sort of, so we have different examples of interventions. For example, here I've included social skills training, which would have been added quite recently.
If you're not on mute, could you please mute yourself? I can't see who it is that's speaking. Just while we've got talkers, presenters, thank you very much.
Thanks. So yeah, just to say that this exists, and on each page, there's sort of a list of questions. So is it effective? How secure is the evidence for it? There's also guidance on how you can implement it well, what things you need to consider if you're wanting to implement the intervention, and what the cost is. So that's just a kind of an overview and a plug of some of the work we do. Another key one of our outputs is the Children Violence and Vulnerability Survey, which is what I'm going to talk about a little bit today. The Children Violence Vulnerability, or CVV survey, is an annual survey that we run, and it's a survey of 13 to 17-year-olds across England and Wales. So it's a survey that's sort of teenagers across England and Wales. They're not necessarily involved in violence or involved in the justice system. Our aim is to sort of get as broad of a sample of teenagers as possible. And the purpose of it is really to ask about children's experiences of violence, in person, in their romantic relationships, online, on social media, and as both victims and perpetrators. We also ask about a range of potential risk and protective factors, so things like whether they've been suspended from school, or whether they have access to trusted adults that they can go to. And we also ask a bit about access to and contact with services such as the police or youth clubs of different positive activities. And the CVV survey has a few different purposes, but the main one is to help us understand the context that we're working in. So we know that different sources show us very different things about the nature of violence. So, for example, when you look at police recorded crime, you can see that plotted on the chart here. This is a sort of really good overall measure of what's happening to overall crime. You can see that over the past 10 years, that is showing that knife crime specifically has really been continually going up. But the problem with police recorded crime is that, particularly at the Youth Endowment Fund, we're really interested specifically in children's experiences, and this isn't child specific. We also know that it's affected by whether people are reporting crimes to the police and recording practices and so on. Alternatively, we have, if we want to look specifically at children who are being affected by violence, we have measures from the justice system. For example, we can look at the number of children who've been cautioned or convicted for violent offences. As you can see, that blue line shows quite a different pattern from the police recorded crime. That's been really going down. And so while this measure is valuable in that it tells us a bit about children specifically, it is also affected by different practices, priorities, capacity of the justice system. Then one final measure that I just wanted to talk about is, which is less impacted by sort of priorities and recording, is we can look at children who have been victims of the most serious types of crime. So here in the yellow line, we've plotted the number of children who've been admitted to hospital for knife assault. And you can see that sort of trend is quite similar to the police recorded crime. And this tells us, as I said, the number of children who've been sort of victims of some of the most severe types of violence, and it's fairly reliable because it's less affected by recording practices. But at the same time, it's a measure of victims specifically, and it's also a very small sample because that's really quite serious violence. So this is where surveys like the CVV come in. And so we have obviously the crime survey of England and Wales, which aims to really, add a new data point. Unfortunately, during COVID, obviously the crime survey really struggled with recruitment, and they're doing a lot to sort of get it back up and running and continue recruiting, particularly for the child sample. But our purpose in starting the CVV survey, we started it 3 years ago, was essentially to add another data point to help us understand the prevalence of violence affecting children as both victims and perpetrators, and essentially add some more evidence to kind of join together to understand what's happening to violence affecting children, how common is it, and also the broader context of what children's experiences are, some more detail on perhaps the reasons that children perpetrating violence, why they're doing it, and also some more information on how the key sectors that we work in are functioning. We know that this additional context can be particularly important when it comes to girls. This is just a chart that I pulled out that sort of demonstrates that across different levels of the justice system and in terms of serious violence, girls do tend to make up quite a small proportion of children and young people who are affected. So, for example, in the latest year, girls made up 21% of children arrested for violent offences. As you know, this means that when we're looking really at sort of national data and national statistics, girls can, kind of fly under the radar a little bit and be underrepresented, and different things can be going on that we're not able to tell when we're looking at the broad whole picture, because most of the children and young people we're looking at are boys. I also thought I would include this quote here, which was a reflection from one of our Youth Advisory Board members on the results from last year, that I think highlights some of the ways in which girls' experiences can simply be different from a young age, and why it is, important to think about this. So, for example, Martha, who is one of our Youth Advisory Board members, reflected, I think the first time I was catcalled, I was 12. That was the start of when I realised that I did feel unsafe, just underlying levels of feeling unsafe all the time when I'm out on my own. And so, I mean, I'm aware that this is a girls' group. You don't need me to tell you that it's really important to look at girls specifically. But I just thought that this was, a reflection that we had from one of the young people with that I kind of wanted to share. So back to the CVV then. So the results I'm going to present to you today are from our third annual survey. So we surveyed over 10,000 13 to 17-year-olds from across England and Wales. The findings were split over 5 separate reports. So the first one, we looked at the overall prevalence of violence, how many children have been victims and perpetrators of violence, what their experiences were, who was it that had perpetrated violence against them, why was it that children were perpetrating that violence, and who is more likely to be affected. The second report, we looked at experiences of violence on social media, particularly exposure to violent content, and exposure to content such as stuff that's promoting violence against women and girls. The third report, which is probably most relevant to today, we looked at gender and relationships and how boys and girls differently experience violence, and we also asked new questions on experience of violence within romantic relationships. Our fourth report was looking at children's views and experiences of the police. And our fifth report was looking at who has access to positive activities, youth clubs, and trusted adults. Very briefly then on the methods, it was an online survey completed by teenagers. And so I think that's important to note that these weren't, these weren't in-depth interviews. It was an online survey that children sort of clicked through to answer a series of questions. They were recruited via online panels of adults. So we partnered with a survey partner who often does sort of online polling. And obviously, when it comes to 13 to 15-year-olds in particular, we need their parental consent to, participate in the survey. So we recruited them via their parents. Data collection happened between May and July last year. It took on average about 14 minutes to complete the survey. And we really aimed for a nationally representative sample in terms of age, gender, ethnicity, region, and socioeconomic status. So as I said, this is a sort of broad nationally representative sample that I'm presenting results from today, not specifically children who have been involved in violence or in the justice system in some way. When we asked children about their experiences, we typically asked about what had happened to them in the past year. And I think it's also important to mention here for this presentation that we specifically, when I'm talking about results and how they differ across genders, we specifically split them into just girls and boys. We did ask whether children had other gender identities, but so few of them did that we can't really report those results reliably. So we mainly focus on girls and boys. I also really don't want a session that's based on girls to be purely framed in terms of and sort of in opposition to boys' experiences. But I do think that for a lot of our results, it's quite useful context to compare what girls said to what boys said. So that's what I'm going to do throughout the presentation so that we can see how they differ. Of course, I'm happy to be challenged on that. So if anyone, has any reflections on that, would be more than happy to discuss that at the end as well. So in terms of the results that I'm going to talk about, I've sort of split it into three key parts. So firstly, I'll talk a little bit about girls' experiences as victims of violence. Then I'll look at the overlaps between victimization and perpetration. And then I thought I'd try to end on a slightly more positive note and look at girls' experiences of potential sources of support. So firstly then, what are girls' experiences of victims? As a broad overview, broad summary, we see that a worrying minority of girls have had direct experiences of violence. But we actually see that the majority, most girls, are worried about becoming victims, even if they haven't experienced that themselves. And when we compare them to boys, we do see that their experiences tend to be slightly different. Diving in then, we see that of the roughly 5,000 girls that we sampled, 1 in 6 said that they had been victims of violence, so that's 16%. And half of those 16% say that the violence had resulted in some physical injury, so they'd been cut, scratched, bruised as a result of that violence. You'll see here that I've sort of included a few different types of violence. And so our any violence measure is basically for anyone who had experienced any of these 4 different types of violence. So physical assault, sexual assault, robbery, and weapons violence. You can see that girls are less likely to have been victims of all types of violence apart from sexual assault than boys. But the differences aren't actually that large. They're not as large as you might expect them to be when you're looking at the sort of national data, when you're looking at justice system data, or when you're looking at hospital admissions for knife assault or homicides. Obviously, these there's a different threshold for the type of violence that we're asking about in the survey, but I think it is, quite important to note. We also, as I mentioned this year, asked about the experiences that children had in their romantic relationships, whether they'd experienced violent and controlling behaviours in those. And we found that 1 in 5 girls who had been in a relationship said that they had experienced physical or sexual relationship violence. So we asked about a range of different experiences here. I won't go through all of them, but it ranged from sending you constant messages, checking up on you, which was the most commonly reported, down to things that are a lot more severe. So 15% of girls in relationships said that they'd been forced or pressured to do something sexual they didn't want to do. 12% said that they'd been hit, kicked, or shoved. And 10% said that their partner has shared explicit or intimate images or videos of them online without their consent. So these are really, quite worrying numbers. Going back to overall experiences of violence, we see that girls are most likely to be victims of violence from acquaintances, so someone they know who isn't a friend or a family member. That accounts for about half of girls who'd been victims said it had been from someone they didn't know. We just see that the next most common is violence from a friend, then a stranger, and the least likely is violence from a family member. When we looked at where children were experiencing violence, we found that school tended to be the place where most children were most likely to experience violence. That's unsurprising. That's where children spend amount of their time. And that was the case for both boys and girls. We also see after school and on the way to and from school that parks, commons, or other public spaces were the sort of next most common. Girls are slightly more likely to say that they've experienced violence at home compared to boys, but that isn't a significant difference. But where we do see a real difference is girls are a lot more likely to say they've experienced violence in friends' or relatives' homes, whereas boys are a lot more likely to say they've experienced violence sort of in other public spaces like sports grounds or cinemas or youth centres. We don't have a sort of explanation of why. We don't have more information on these incidents, but I think that's probably partly unsurprising and speaks a little bit to perhaps where boys and girls are spending their time, if they're doing so differently, and where they are most at risk. We found that most girls who had experienced violence, who had been a victim, had told someone about the violence they experienced, which is really positive. So 90% said that they had told at least someone that they had been a victim. It was most often it was a parent or carer, followed by a friend, followed by school staff. But they are slightly less likely to have than boys. So 93% of boys had told someone. And that difference is quite small. That 3% is small, but it is statistically significant. And I think one of the interesting things to point out here is while it's really great and valuable and good news that most girls are telling someone about violence they've experienced, I sort of wonder what is happening to that 10%. Why have they not told anyone? Is it because they don't have anyone that they can go to? And I'll get onto a little bit about children's access to trusted adults in a few slides' time. So we've seen that there is really a concerning but minority of girls who have been directly affected by violence. But we also see that actually the majority, when asked, are concerned about being a victim. So 2/3 of girls said that they had concerns. They were worried about being a victim themselves. And these fears are clearly having real impacts. So 1/3 of all girls, said that they had changed where they went and what they did in order to avoid violence or because their fears of violence. 28% said that they'd changed how they travel. 21% said they changed their appearance in some way. 20%, so 1 in 5, said that they'd had trouble eating, sleeping, or concentrating in school. 19% said that they had had some changes to their relationships with friends and with family. And the sort of least common answer, so a really small number, but still a worrying 6% of girls, of the 5,000 girls we surveyed, said that they'd done things to protect themselves, such as joining a gang or and so again, that small 6% is potentially quite a worrying figure in itself, because we know that some of these actions can actually put them at further risk. So I then wanted to look a little bit at how victimization and perpetration intersect with each other. And the broad overview is that we see, again, a worrying minority of girls have perpetrated violence themselves, and are also at risk of criminal exploitation. And we see that girls who've been victims of violence are more likely to perpetrate violence as well. So there's a real overlap between these experiences of victimization and perpetration. So compared to boys, girls are less likely to perpetrate violence. That's probably unsurprising, but the difference is slightly smaller than expected. So of the girls we surveyed, we found that 11% said they'd perpetrated violence in the past year. This compares to 21% of boys. We also saw that the violence they perpetrated was less likely to result in injury. So around 1/3 of girls who'd perpetrated violence said the person was injured as a result. This compares to just over half of boys. So they're less likely to perpetrate violence, and the violence they are committing is less severe. But that is still, perhaps a large number than we had expected. We also tried to ask a little bit in our survey to try and get at risk of criminal exploitation. This is really difficult to do, and this is something we're working on for the next iteration of the survey. But to try and get at it, we asked about whether children had gone missing overnight without their parents' consent. We asked whether they had been asked by someone else to carry drugs, weapons, or money. And we also explicitly asked whether they had been in a gang. And again, we see that 11% of girls said that they'd gone missing. 7% said that they'd been asked by someone else to carry drugs, weapons, or money for them. And 4% said they'd been in a gang. So again, while these are small percentages, these translate to quite large numbers. Something we're thinking about, though, is potentially the ways in which criminal exploitation can look different for girls and for boys. What we haven't been able to ask about is a sort of sexual exploitation element. Obviously, all of these questions are really sensitive and difficult, but if anyone has any, reflections on anything like that, that would be really, really valued. Then going on to the overlap between perpetration and victimization, we see that half of the girls who said that they've perpetrated violence have been victims themselves. And when we ask girls why they had committed violence, the most common reasons were that they had been baited, threatened, annoyed or humiliated. The person had been violent to them before, they'd been bullied, it was in self-defense. These are the most common reasons that are given. There isn't a huge amount more to say about this. I think this is quite self-evident. I haven't compared it to boys here. Boys are, for example, more likely to give gang, neighborhood, or school rivalries as an example. But I think the main point to take away from this is that there is a huge overlap between perpetration and victimization, as we know. And that these are the reasons that girls are giving for the violence that's happening. We also really worryingly see that while in most cases adults did find out about the violence that happened, the majority of girls who perpetrated violence weren't actually offered any support or training. So only 8% of girls who had perpetrated violence said that they were offered some support to try and help them change their behavior. And this is less, they're less likely to receive this than boys were. Now, part of this could be related to the types of violence they're committing being less serious. But it could also be, related to the different ways that girls are treated. And perhaps it is that these instances of violence are being taken less seriously, which is, potentially a cause for concern and something to reflect on and think about. Finally, then, sort of final section that I wanted to cover is what do we know about the potential sources of support that children may have access to? And we see that girls are less likely to do positive activities outside of school, but are more likely to have someone at school that they can go to for support. So as I said, girls are less likely to regularly do activities. We do see that the majority of children in general and the majority of girls do some sort of positive activity at least once a month. So 80% of girls said they did so. But they are less likely than boys to be doing these activities. That is mainly down to differences in terms of girls are less likely to take part in sports, whereas they're more likely to take part in arts activities, to be employed. We also asked children whether they attended some sort of youth club, and we see that only a third of girls said that they attended one compared to almost half of boys. We don't know why this is, because we also asked this year whether children were sort of worried how safe they felt in youth clubs and youth settings. Girls and boys didn't report any differences there, so it's unlikely that it's because girls feel a lack of safety. But for some reason, they are less likely to be doing these positive activities out of the house regularly, setting. So that's just something to think about, thinking about how to support girls and also where to find them, where they might be most comfortable. And then finally, we see that girls have different sources of support to boys. So girls and boys were equally likely to have some form of trusted adult outside of the household, who wasn't a family member. But girls were a lot more likely to say that they trusted a teacher or someone at school compared to boys, whereas boys were more likely to say that they had a sports coach that they trusted, which will be unsurprising given the previous slide, when we see that that boys were more likely to take part in sports. So again, this is kind of something that we are thinking about in terms of who is it that girls are going to. They seem to be slightly less likely to access trusted adults in other spaces, but more likely to trust teachers. And what is it that what can we take from that? So a summary then of this sort of fairly quick fire, a lot of percentages. I realized that I there's been a lot of bar charts. But the overall message is that from our survey, we found that girls are less likely than boys to be directly affected by violence, but rates are still actually quite high. When we ask about their fears about violence, we do see that most are worried about becoming victims. So even if they're less likely to actually be experiencing that violence, their worries about it are impacting their lives. And we see that girls who've perpetrated violence are a lot more likely to have been victims themselves. But actually, when we ask those girls, we find that the majority haven't received any support from adults. And then finally, we see that potential sources of support look slightly different for girls than they do for boys. So then I mentioned at the start that I had a few very sort of broad questions that I would kind of love if anyone had any reflections on. Obviously, if you have questions for me, I'd really welcome those. But I'm just curious, do these results that we have from this survey fit with your own experience? Are there different interpretations you think there could be to the results? Anything you disagree with? Anything that looks very different compared to the girls that you actually work with yourselves? Do you have any sense of what girls' perspectives are on the impacts of their experiences? Are there any things that we're missing? Are there sort of questions that we should be asking that we're not, about the reasons for violence or the impacts of violence? And finally, what should we be thinking about when we're running the survey this year? In this green box here, I've just listed a few of the topics that we're asking about a lot more in this year's survey, which is currently sort of in the middle of data collection. So this year we're asking a lot more about relationship violence, not only in terms of experiencing violence in relationships, but committing it as well, and also the gender of the person that you're in a relationship who's doing these things. We've also added some questions on the perceived acceptability of different sexually aggressive behaviours to see how that links up with these experiences. We've added a lot of questions on mental health. We've touched on domestic violence. I think, as I mentioned before, we've tried to do a bit more to try and further understand children's experiences of gangs and risk of exploitation, so routes into and out of gangs, what those experiences are like. And we've also asked a little bit about extremism on social media, so seeing different types of content. And I know that the sort of public discourse on particularly on social media extremism is often focused around boys, but do you think, are there any sort of things that we should be thinking about specifically in relation to girls in this space and in this context? I might then exit my screen so that I can actually see you all.
Yeah, we've got some really interesting comments here in the chat, Cassie. I don't know if you've managed to open it yet, but some quite sort of, I think what's coming out here is that people are saying that they feel they would get quite different answers within their own services, and talking about the kind of the vast majority of girls open to Leicestershire, for example, are victims of sexual violence and relationship abuse, have witnessed domestic abuse, long history of victimisation, and then just some speculation about that societal bias around sort of attitudes towards women's pain and women's experiences, the kind of victim blaming tendencies, and whether that's playing into some of these findings. And it's very interesting. So I think you mentioned this at the beginning, and I didn't actually quite catch it. How many girls were involved in the survey? What were the sort of numbers of children that were involved? Well, girls and then children generally, and the sort of age ranges and so on, because obviously some of that will be playing into this as well, won't it?
Absolutely, and I would be really curious if anyone, did feel able to share a bit more about what the differences are. So yeah, it was roughly 5,000 girls that we surveyed. It was 10,000 in total, and we had a roughly equal split of boys and girls. And they were aged 13 to 17. We kind of a roughly equal split across ages. But this group, is we tried to make it representative, so it's likely a lot less potentially vulnerable, have a lot fewer risk factors than potentially those that you might be working with. But yeah, if anyone had any sort of reflections on what those differences are, that would be incredibly interesting and useful to hear about.
It's interesting because even in that mainstream group that you were looking at, there's still real experiences of girls' experience of being victims, and some significant differences from the boys' and girls' experience about support structures, who to report to, and those kind of things. So there's, even in that generic population, there's key differences, and you'd expect those key differences to kind of feed through to those youth justice differences as well. But anyhow, so we've got questions popping up. If people have got, if people want to ask anything, please feel free to put it in the chat, or put your hand up and we'll come to you. So Liz.
Yeah, I was really surprised. I think sometimes when you work in youth justice, you forget how we work with a really small percentage of the national population. And so some of the statistics, I was thinking, God, that's low. And then when you got to the bit about youth clubs and you said about 50% of boys or 30%, and I thought, yeah, this is not our I think you'd struggle to find one or two of our young people who would be accessing youth clubs. And so that reminded me that actually this isn't just a yacht population, this is national. Do you know what I mean? So it is helpful, but then I think, like Leicestershire said, the sexual violence statistic was just mad to me, because I think the vast majority of girls that we come across have been victims of sexual violence or domestic violence. So for that to have been really low, but I think it's still useful. Like, it reminds us how vulnerable our girls are. So.
Thank you, Liz. So I'll keep an eye on the hands. Jenny, if you want, I'll come to you every now and then you can pick up the chat. Yeah. So I'll go to Michelle next, and then Jenny, you pick up the chat.
I'll pick up some chat then, yeah.
I think what's really interesting is what you've been saying, what someone's put a comment in there about like victim blaming if behaviours are not ladylike. I thought we'd got rid of that years and years ago, but it sounds like it's still going on, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? And that's quite worrying, really, that as a society we haven't changed our views on that. That's my thoughts.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Michelle. And I think, when we did the session a few months ago, and we were looking at the experience of girls, and not just in gendered violence, but in terms of kind of misogynistic attitudes. And, when you look at kind of rape conviction rates and so on, and the stats around experience of sexual assault and sexual violence, and that isn't just within our youth justice service cohorts, that's broadly across the population. But what is quite interesting is that this particular survey doesn't sort of bear up what other sources tell us around sexual violence in particular. And I suppose there's questions there around knowing a girl having the ability to know what experiences she's had in terms of whether they would actually constitute sexual violence as well. So yeah, it's very worrying, isn't it, Michelle?
And it's quite, quite worrying. There's a lot of sort of like talk about I can't say the word misogyny, maybe that's how you say it, and incel and all that, and it feels like we're going backwards rather than forwards, And
I think the survey gave a really clear indication that girls were changing their behaviour as a result of their experience of violence. Really clear footprint of that. Okay, Jenny, if you want to go to the chat.
Yeah, we've got a couple of things popping up in the chat, which is really interesting. So Helen from HMIP she said I think she'd quite like to join in the discussion. She can't because she's actually on a train at the moment. But she was talking about the out of court disposal thematic inspection. It's going to be published in September, and talking about some of the girls within that cohort and whether that's going to so she's sort of raising that as something that might be worth considering in the survey next time, and some of the findings from the out of court thematic. So some interesting thoughts there, and then mentioning, of course, of Andrew Tate, online misogyny, and influencing societal attitudes and attitudes towards men and women across society, and that potentially then leading to internalized misogyny within young women. So, and I think that's something, certainly I've picked up with services that I work with in terms of the girls and the girls groups that they've set up, sort of just the language that they might use about other girls. It's those kind of really misogynistic attitudes. So I think that's a really interesting one. Thank you, Veronica. And then Adela, our Adela from the YJB, has said there's some research on this which points out that girls are less likely to be identified as victims if they don't fit the damsel in distress or ideal victim stereotype, and many other victim blaming perceptions arise. So that whole she was looking for trouble, what she'd expect, why did she go there, that whole why did she wear that, all of those sorts of attitudes. If a victim's not the perfect victim, and obviously we look at intersections of race and class and so on within that, alcohol use, substance misuse, and what have you. So I think that's a really, we're having loads popping up in the chat now. I think what I'll do is I'll bring Samantha in, so we'll get not just me talking, then we'll come back and do some more of the chat as well.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you, Jenny. Just before I go over to Samantha, just reminding people to think about that other point that Cassandra raised, which is what other questions you think might be useful for next year's survey. So also have a think about that, because you're working with some of these children that have got these extreme life experiences that they come with them. So have a think about and pop that in the chat as well, while we've got this kind of breathing space while I'm just about to invite Samantha in. So think about other questions for next year as well. Samantha?
Hi, thank you. It's a really interesting presentation. I just wondered how much consideration had been given to neurodivergent girls, especially, with the fact that they're often misdiagnosed or they're diagnosed later in life, and a lot of the interventions that we deliver or offer to our young people are mainly tailored around boys, and that, the typical behaviours that girls often present with can be kind of misdiagnosed with being neuro issues, and they're often not. Sometimes they're trauma. It's a big, long question, but I just kind of wondered what consideration had been given and how many of the young girls that you interviewed or worked with were displaying kind of neurodivergent symptoms and traits.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. For these results, I don't have the numbers, unfortunately, but this is something that we're planning to look at a lot more in this year's survey, as we've asked about whether children suspect they have or have been diagnosed with a variety of different mental health conditions, neurodevelopmental conditions, and so on, and also what support they are receiving for those. And so you raise a really good point around, what can we expect that to look like for girls specifically? And I imagine, as you say, there probably will be some gender differences, and how does that play into the support children receiving and how does that play into their sort of experiences of violence as well? So unfortunately, I can't answer your question, but it's a good one.
Well, thank you. I know it was a long-winded question, but it was really something for consideration for everybody. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Jenny, over to the chat.
Yeah, and actually, you know, some kind of folk chipping in there to say agree regarding neurodivergence, that's an area perhaps of for attention and consideration next time. And a number of services talking about girls, increasing numbers of girls, which was sort of really the reason we set up this group. So a number of girls involved in youth justice interventions have risen in Derbyshire, and in other services as well. We've had a mention of, again, some of those online trends and influence, extremism and so on, the kind of the tradwife trend. I don't know if everybody's heard of that, but that's a kind of a trend for tradwife stands for sort of traditional wife, and this trend of certain influencers being traditional and, you know, kind of obedient towards their husband and fulfilling those very kind of traditional gender norms, dressing in a particular way and so on, and that's been targeted at younger women and sort of reflecting and mirroring some of the incel type culture and beliefs around gender norms. Birmingham, lots of victims of sexual assault in Birmingham in the girls that have been coming into service over the last 6 months, where girls have said they've made previous disclosures but didn't receive any support until they were referred to the YJS. That's a really sobering thought, isn't it, and a really upsetting thing to consider, and thinking more broadly about the support that girls are getting, and really speaking to what you said there, Cassandra, about the support girls have received, and, you know, thankfully getting that support from Youth Justice Service, but perhaps more broadly within the population, that's those support mechanisms are not there. Really interesting one here from Fiona, thank you. Focus on police encounters in the context of mental health crisis would be beneficial, and considered that. And, you know, certainly I've, you know, where we're seeing emergency work assault and how that's kind of increased in terms of the gravity matrix. So that's something perhaps to consider next year, potentially, those police encounters and violence potentially occurring there. There's some research by UCLan, the University of Lancashire, into social media influences on children, especially those with neurodivergence, coming into youth justice. So it might be some interesting work around that. And we've got a question here for Cassandra in the group. Some girls find the label victim patronising and don't perceive themselves as such. How do you overcome this in research and practice? Do we need to expand our definition of victim, or do we need to use this term, or even use this term at all, and focus on vulnerabilities instead? I'll open that one up because I think there's a sort of a general question there, and Cassie, you may have some thoughts in terms of what's coming through. So just about labelling, the use of the word victim, is that helpful? What can we do in terms of research and practice? And we'll open that one up.
I could possibly just jump in while other people are thinking about that. In our survey and in our writing of the reports, we've thought really carefully about these labels, victim and also perpetrator. You know, it comes with difficulties, as you say. Victim can feel patronizing. It might not be how someone feels or how they want to see themselves. In terms of both the survey and how we write about it, we've decided ultimately that it's sort of clearer to do it that way. And we ask kind of a broad question: have you been a victim of violence? And then we also ask, have you experienced these specific experiences, so physical assault, and we provide definitions for those. And we do see there is quite a lot of overlap between those who say, most who say they've experienced these specific experiences also would say, yes, I've been a victim of violence. But that definitely doesn't mean that it's a sort of perfect label. And yeah, I think personally we haven't necessarily found the best way to do this. And I think this is potentially, as I think someone pointed out a little bit, one of the limitations that we have when we're looking at the results, particularly when it maybe comes to sexual assault, maybe comes to relationship violence. Do children see those questions and identify with it? And particularly for girls, if certain experiences are more normalized, maybe they don't identify with that because it has become more normalized.
Okay, thank you. Jenny, I'm going to do last bit from the comments and the chats, and then I think we'll have to wrap this up because we've got other presenters in the wings.
Yeah, we've got harmed person mentioned as another phrase that sort of can be used. So thank you for that, Melanie, and obviously that whole victim, survivor, and so on, and interesting to sort of ponder that. And we could probably dedicate an entire discussion to that alone, couldn't we? There's so much here to unpick. We've got another service actually in Hull talking about girls who have, so they've got 13% of girls in the cohort, which is an increase for them. And a big proportion have stated they haven't had support previously. So there's various, for a lot of the children are there, the girls are there for assaults and social media offences, but have had negative experiences, including with health, dismissed with physical health conditions, including neurodivergence. So that kind of perhaps disbelief, the health experience alone is a really significant thing, isn't it? But also just generally not having been able to access the support or to be offered or given the support that they've needed. Mention about dolls here, and again, that's deprivation of liberty orders. That's been something that we've certainly had in some intelligence around in terms of increases and significance there. Something here perhaps to explore further around intergenerational trauma and experiences of staying within the family unit. So this is from Fiona, who says that she doesn't think she's worked with a single girl who hasn't experienced violence, be that in the home, at school, or from a partner. And I think, again, that speaks to that more broad experience, doesn't it, of girls and their lived experience. So absolutely loads there. Sorry, I've rattled through those because I think each one probably deserves a discussion in its own right. But as ever, we are limited by the time that we have. So thank you. And thank you, Cassie. That was really, really interesting. I think as well, if people have got further, to think about that some more, if folk have got further kind of suggestions and comments, Cassie, obviously we're happy. If you want to contact Tracy or myself, we can pass things on to Cassie and get some of those thoughts for next year's survey. I think would be really, really helpful.
So yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Jenny, for gathering everything from the chat. I think you did an absolutely marvellous job of that. Thank you so much, Cassandra. I know you've rattled huge amount of information, really interesting stuff. I think there's something really interesting about the difference about the core population of girls and those in youth justice. And actually sometimes we get a kind of bit inured to some of the trauma that some of the children that we work with in youth justice, and it's really refreshing to know it's not all girls out there, but even those girls out there that aren't open to youth justice are still having significant life trauma events and experience of victims of serious violence and violence that will have an impact on them and how they see their world. Cassie, I think you've agreed you'll send the slide pack to me. I will send that out to everybody in due course. If anyone's got any additional questions that you want to raise, or you've got some ideas about next year, it will be next year's survey, then you can feed those through to me and I will forward those on. So thank you very much indeed. I hope you will join me in thanking Cassie.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's really, it's great to get your reflections and any further questions or comments you have on how we can better understand that much smaller sample would be, really, really appreciated. So thank you for having me.
It's been an absolute pleasure. I don't know if that, Sarah, are you hand up or a misplaced clap?
I were meant to be clapping.
Okay. I'm very used to it. The two buttons are next to each other. Bill Gates needs to sort that out. So thank you very much, Cassandra. You're very welcome to stay. It's entirely up to you. I would say we might. I think we'll plough on and not have a break, only because I want to give due time and consideration for the next topic that's coming up. So I hope you're okay with that. If you feel that you can sneak off quietly and get yourself a cup of tea, then please do so. But rather than have a full break and let everyone go and come back, we'll carry on if that's all right with everybody. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen in one moment. As soon as it allows me to. Okay, am I back on?
Yes, we are now.
All right, lovely, thank you. So it would be amiss of us to not talk about this topic without talking about the violence against women and girls. I'm actually deliberately not going to be using any acronyms in this space. I think I just think if we're going to talk about it properly, we need to use its full language. So just a reminder about government policy currently is to halve violence against women and girls. I think within a 10-year period, I can't rightly remember, but the policy is to halve violence against women and girls. And I've just put up there a UN definition of what we mean by violence against women. And actually the UN definition doesn't include girls. So I've added that in as a kind of in the brackets, which is just an addition from there. So the UN definition of violence against women and girls means any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual or psychological harm or suffering to women. And again, I've added girls in there. So there's a lot of activity around reducing violence against women and girls. And the next slide, again, this talks back to what Jenny was talking about in the last time we met in terms of girls' overall experience of being a victim. So overall, 50%, this is from an ONS survey in 2022. So this is a bigger age range and includes adults. 58% of women aged 16 to 34 reported feeling very or fairly unsafe on public transport after dark. 30% of women have experienced workplace harassment, with 81% reported they've been harassed by a man or men, and 70% of women in the UK say they've experienced sexual harassment in public. And that goes back to the quote from the youth ambassador at the very beginning that Cassandra was talking about. So one of their youth ambassadors talking about being catcalled at the age of 12, a really young age, but you know, that then becomes her life experience. So just wanted to mention White Ribbon, and in a minute I'm going to ask Kirsty and Colleen to come in from Hull. So White Ribbon is an internationally recognised symbol for ending men's violence against women and girls. And this is just really talking to, very often when we're talking about violence against girls, there's lots of conversations about how girls can change their behaviour. So we saw that in the slide pack that Cassandra presented about how girls change their behaviour. And it's very much the emphasis has historically been on what changes girls need to do and women need to do to keep themselves safe. And this is really about shifting the narrative a bit and talking about what men and boys can do in order to step up and play their part in keeping girls and women safe. So White Ribbon, leading charity engaging men and boys to end violence against women and girls. They have a preventative approach and want to stop violence before it starts by challenging its root causes, particularly harmful male cultures and gender norms. And again, we've talked reference today the whole Andrew Tate dialogue and the influence he's now having on young men and boys. So they partner with many organisations and work closely with government across England and Wales to influence culture, change in workplaces and communities, and push for legislative change. And just to say that the YJB is now committed to be a White Ribbon accredited organisation. So I'm just going to pause there because I think that's a good point